So we're starting Unit 2, which is the colonial period, and we're going to talk about why people would immigrate from England and choose to come to the colonies that the British created in North America. And then we're going to talk about the first British colony, which was Jamestown. So why did people immigrate from England? And immigrate here is spelled with an E. When it's spelled with an E, it means to exit a country. So we're looking at why would people choose to exit or leave England? And there were several reasons that would lead people to want to leave their home country and come to the new colonies. One would be that England was very overpopulated during this time period, so there were a lot of people, which meant that there was a lack of available land. And remember that land was very important to Europeans because they saw it as a symbol of status and wealth, and that you had to own land to be able to vote and things like that. Well, while there was a lack of available land in England, the British saw the New World as having all of this land that they could have access to, even though, remember, that belonged to the Native Americans. So because of the overpopulation, there was also a lot of unemployment, which led to a lot of poverty in England. So people were trying to escape that and find opportunities in the New World. And then a lot of people who were criminals saw the New World as a place for them to have a second chance and leave their crime behind them, as well as people who were in debtor's prison. So people who were in debtor's prison were arrested because they had failed to pay their bills or their debts, and so they were sent to prison until they could pay off their debts. The problem with that is that they weren't working or making any money while they were in prison, so debtor's prison just became really, really packed with a ton of people in there. And so they saw the New World as a place that these people could go and start over. And then some people will leave England because they're seeking religious freedom in the colonies to practice the religion that they want to in the way that they want to. So the first colony that the British established was actually the Roanoke colony, but remember that was the lost colony, so it failed. But Jamestown was the first permanent colony, so it's the first successful British colony. Although Jamestown has a lot of problems and it almost doesn't succeed. As you can see from this picture, Jamestown is located in a very swampy area. It's right off of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. It was really hot, it was really muggy. It was the best breeding place for mosquitoes, which meant that there will be a lot of problems with malaria and things like that. So they built the James Fort right here on the James River. And this is a model of what the James Fort would have looked like once they settled here in 1607. And so the Jamestown colony, its survival was pretty questionable in the beginning. So for one thing, they had high death rates, going back again to the problem with the mosquitoes and the malaria. That's going to cause a lot of death, as well as the fact that there were a lot of frequent changes in leadership. So there was no stability in who was leading the Jamestown colony. And they had inadequate supplies from England, but more and more people just kept coming after the initial settlers started the colony in 1607, but they didn't bring enough supplies and equipment and things like that with them. And the people who were coming to Jamestown were typically poor men from England. In fact, the first 100 settlers were all men. There were no women. And they really want to find gold and strike it rich in Jamestown. They had heard the stories of how the Spanish had gotten rich off of their colonies in South America. And so they get off the ship and they just start looking for gold. And they don't plant any crops or anything like that. And so eventually they were running out of a food supply. They never actually find gold in Jamestown. And so in the winter of 1609 to 1610, it's known as the starving time in Jamestown. It was the harshest winter on record in the Jamestown colony, and 60 out of the 500 people who were in Jamestown survived. So only 60 out of 500 people actually lived through the starving time. By 1616, about 80% of the immigrants who had first arrived in the colony were dead. And so again, we're seeing those high death rates from malaria, from the starving time, from other diseases. And so John Smith begins to get the colony back on its feet. He's going to institute a lot of strict laws and policies so that the colony could survive. And one of the reasons that he needed to institute really strict and harsh laws and policies was because During the starving time, one of the things the colonists did to survive was they turned to cannibalism. Now, keep in mind that already in 1607, you can see these were burials just from the first settlers that arrived. So by 1609, 1610, there's already a lot of death, and then they have this really bad winter, and they're running out of food. They don't have enough supplies, and many historians thought that people at Jamestown had participated in cannibalism. There were kind of mentions in their diaries and stuff about how hungry they were, and they did unspeakable things to survive. But about 7 years ago, archaeologists found this skull, and they dated it to a girl who was around 14 years old. They named her Jane. They don't actually know who she was, but they found her skull, and you can see here kind of the marks as they're trying to saw into her head. And then later on the back part of her skull, you can see a blow to the skull where they're trying to get the brain meat. I'm going to post an article and a video with some more information about this in case you're curious, because it's pretty interesting. And so Jane was already dead. It's not like they were killing people to eat them. Remember, out of 500 people, only 60 lived. So they're trying to eat people to stay alive. And archaeologists actually discovered this. I'm going to put a picture of it on here. Yes, in the cellar kitchen. So her skull was found with remains of other animal bones that they would have eaten, like squirrel bones, things like that, in this area that was known as the cellar kitchen. So after cannibalism, John Smith instituted some rather harsh laws in Jamestown. Everyone was going to have a job and work. People were going to have to attend church on Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon. Again, he's trying to redirect people to some sense of morality. You weren't allowed to criticize the governor. You weren't allowed to steal from your neighbor. And a lot of the punishments for these laws were death or servitude, just really, really strict punishments in order to prevent people from kind of spiraling back into a bad path again. So Jamestown eventually finds its bearings, and while it never discovers gold, what happens is tobacco becomes the money-producing crop that replaces the search for gold. By the 1680s, Jamestown was producing around 30 million pounds of tobacco a year. And tobacco was introduced by a man named John Ross. He brought the tobacco seeds, and they realized that tobacco would grow really well in Jamestown because it was near a river, it had really good soil, the climate was good, it was hot, so that they could grow tobacco. But as they're growing more and more tobacco and people are creating these large plantations with thousands of acres of tobacco fields, they needed field laborers to help plant and harvest the crops. So at first they're going to use indentured servants. So an indentured servant is someone who was typically poor and they couldn't afford to pay their passage to the colonies. And so someone who was wealthier, probably a tobacco plantation owner, would pay for their passage to Jamestown, and then they would work for that person for 5 to 7 years, and then afterwards they would be set free. This goes on for a little while, but then in 1619, Jamestown is going to shift over to using African slaves. The first African slaves arrive in Jamestown in 1619. Economically, plantation owners thought slavery offered a lot of benefits over using indentured servants, because you didn't have to let them go free after 5 to 7 years, and you didn't have to pay for a new indentured servant. Once you bought a slave, you own that slave for life. So this will begin the system of plantation slavery that we'll see develop throughout the southern colonies and the southern United States up until the Civil War. Also in 1619, Jamestown starts the House of Burgess, which was the first representative assembly in the colonies. So what this meant is that people would actually vote on who would be a member of the House of Burgess, and then the House of Burgess would create laws that would govern the Jamestown colony. But keep in mind, it's only your people who own a lot of land who are able to vote. So still a very small percentage of the population. And then women in Virginia, so because Jamestown was initially settled by men, there isn't a very stable family life like there was in England. And so at first in the colony, women were allowed to take on roles that they really couldn't have assumed in England because they're needed to help work in the tobacco plantations and things like that. So family life looked a lot different in Jamestown than what people were used to coming from England. So here you can see this is the Chesapeake Bay. Here is Jamestown, located near the James River, and eventually they'll continue to spread out to some other areas of Virginia as well. But as they're spreading out, they're going to come into contact and conflict with Native Americans. So when the colonists first arrive in Jamestown, they're pretty peaceful for the Native Americans. For the first 2 years, they have a good trading relationship with them. But then in 1610, conflicts began to emerge as the colonists are increasingly moving on to Native American land. And so in 1622, the Powhatan Indians, who were the main tribe in Jamestown, are going to have an uprising against the colonists. You may recognize the name Powhatan. There's a very famous Native American named Pocahontas who is a part of this tribe. Her father was the chief. He was Chief Powhatan, and then the Powhatan kind of confederacy had multiple different tribes within them. So in 1622, they have the Powhatan uprising, and they kill 25% of the colonists. But in retaliation, the colonists are going to turn around and slaughter the Powhatan Indians and force them to move west and away from the Jamestown colony. So again, Pocahontas was the daughter of Powhatan. Very famous. You probably have seen the Disney movie. She does not marry John Smith. Pocahontas actually marries John Rolfe. So John Rolfe is the guy who brought the tobacco seeds to Jamestown, and Pocahontas actually ends up marrying him, and she will go back to England on a trip with him. And then during that trip, there's actually a portrait that is drawn of Pocahontas, and this is what the real Pocahontas would have looked like. So maybe a little bit different than the Disney version. Pocahontas is around 23 when she goes to England, and on their way back from England to Virginia, she actually dies. So she's very young when she dies. She gets sick on the way home and passes away. So after Jamestown, the British are going to continue to establish colonies. So they'll end up with 13 colonies in North America. And these colonies develop into 3 different regions. You've got the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and then the southern colonies. And each region has unique characteristics that we'll talk about this week. So if you see here, you can see which colony and state is part of each region. And keep this in mind, and as we start working this week, you'll be able to choose one of these colonies that you want to research in some more detail.